Something about this story doesn't quite make sense. In the autumn of 1888, the most powerful empire on earth, a civilization that commanded armies, governed continents, and prided itself on the rule of law, was brought to its knees not by an invading force, not by a revolution, but by a series of handwritten letters. Letters that may never have been written by the person they claimed to represent. Letters that transformed a local horror story into a global panic. And letters that, to this day, have never been conclusively explained. Most people know the name Jack the Ripper. Few people understand what the letters did, not just to the investigation, but to an entire society. Because what happened in London in the autumn of 1888 was not simply a murder case that went unsolved. It was the moment a city lost its mind. And the question historians have quietly argued about ever since is this: did someone help that happen? To understand the fear, you must first understand the world into which it arrived. The year 1888 stands near the peak of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 51 years. The British Empire stretches across a quarter of the Earth's surface. London is the largest city in the world, home to nearly 5 million people, and it is a city of extraordinary contradictions. In the West, there are townhouses, gas lights, and drawing rooms where gentlemen read the evening papers over brandy. In the East, there is Whitechapel. Whitechapel, in 1888, is a district that belongs to a different London entirely. It is overcrowded beyond modern imagination. Thousands of immigrants, many fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, have poured into its narrow streets. Unemployment is severe. Disease is common. The average life expectancy for a laborer in the East End is well below 40 years. According to records compiled by social investigator Charles Booth, who was conducting his landmark poverty survey of London, at precisely this time, nearly 35% of the residents of East London live in conditions described as chronic poverty or worse. The police who patrol these streets are stretched thin. The Metropolitan Police Force, founded only 60 years earlier, is still developing its investigative methods. Forensic science, as we understand it today, does not yet exist. It is into this world, tense, overcrowded, politically anxious, that the autumn of 1888 arrives. Between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, 1888, at least 5 women are murdered in and around the Whitechapel district. Their names are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The murders are brutal in a manner that shocks even the hardened journalists of the Victorian press. The killer has not merely attacked his victims, he has, in several cases, mutilated them with what investigators describe as some degree of anatomical knowledge. The police investigate. They question witnesses, examine crime scenes, and pursue numerous suspects. They make no arrest. But the murders, disturbing as they are, remain largely a local affair for the first weeks. The East End has seen violence before. London newspapers cover the killings, but the coverage, while prominent, has not yet reached the pitch of hysteria. Then, the letters begin to arrive. On the 27th of September, 1888, the Central News Agency, a wire service that distributed news stories to newspapers across Britain, receives a letter. It is written in red ink. It is addressed to the boss. And it is signed, for the first time in recorded history, with a name that will echo for over a century: Jack the Ripper. The letter taunts the police. It promises more murders. It refers to the killings with a chilling familiarity. 2 days later, a postcard arrives at the same agency, again signed with the same name, appearing to reference the double murder of Stride and Eddowes, which had occurred the night before. This postcard, the timing suggested, may have been written before the murders were publicly known, and the Central News Agency shares the letters with the Metropolitan Police. The police, in a decision that will be analysed and questioned for generations, authorised their publication. Within days, the letters are reproduced in newspapers across England. The name Jack the Ripper is printed in headlines from London to Edinburgh. Within weeks, it crosses the Atlantic. The panic, now given a name and a signature, becomes something far larger than a murder investigation. Here is where the official story begins to develop its shadows. The Metropolitan Police themselves were uncertain about the letters from the beginning. Several senior investigators, including Chief Inspector John Littlechild and Detective Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, expressed private doubts about their authenticity. In internal memos that remained classified for decades, officers suggested the letters may have been written not by the murderer at all, but by a journalist seeking to sensationalize the case. That theory has never gone away. The Central News Agency occupies an interesting position in this story. It was the sole recipient of the two most famous letters, the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jack postcard. Both arrived there before being forwarded to Scotland Yard. No other genuine correspondence attributed to a murderer, before or since, was first routed through a commercial newswire service. When historians have examined the agency's records from this period, a curious absence appears. The internal documentation surrounding how these letters were handled, who received them, and who made the decision to forward them has never been fully recovered. A journalist named Charles Moore was later suspected by some researchers of involvement in the letter's creation. Another name that surfaces in archival speculation is Tom Bulling, a journalist connected to the agency. Neither accusation has ever been conclusively proven, but the circumstantial geography is worth noting. The letters arrived at a place whose business was news, and the letters, whatever else they were extraordinarily good for the news business. In the weeks following publication, newspaper circulation figures for the major London dailies surged dramatically. The Star, the Evening News, and the Pall Mall Gazette all saw remarkable increases in readership. The Ripper story had become, in the language of a later century, a media event. Examine the letters more carefully, and certain patterns begin to emerge. Forensic linguists who have studied the correspondence in the modern era note that the two most famous letters, the ones that named the killer, share a strikingly different register from other correspondence attributed to the Ripper. They are theatrical. They are literate in a peculiar way, educated enough to craft menace, but deliberately disguised to appear crude. They use American slang in a way that several analysts have described as performed rather than natural. Contrast this with the From Hell letter, a third piece of correspondence sent not to a news agency, but directly to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, in October 1888. This letter arrived with a preserved portion of a human kidney, being later examined by a physician who suggested it may have come from one of the victims. The From Hell letter is written in an entirely different style. It is almost incoherent. It is visceral and strange in a way that the earlier letters are not. Most serious researchers today believe the From Hell letter has a far stronger claim to authenticity than the famous Dear Boss correspondence. Yet it was the Dear Boss letter, the theatrical one, the one with the invented name, that defined the case. That shaped how the police conducted their investigation. That told the public what to fear and how to imagine it. The authentic voice, if it was one, was largely drowned out by the louder, more polished performance. This is a pattern that students of history will recognize. A sensational account displaces a quieter, more complicated truth. The story that is easy to repeat becomes the story that is remembered. In the archives of Scotland Yard, there exists a file known as the Little Child Letter. It was written in 1913 by former Chief Inspector John Littlechild, who had headed the secret department of the Metropolitan Police during the Ripper investigation. The letter was addressed to journalist George Sims and remained unknown to researchers until 1993, over a century after the murders. In it, Littlechild names a suspect entirely absent from official accounts and makes clear that there were investigations and suspicions operating entirely outside the public record. The existence of this letter raises an uncomfortable question. If a senior intelligence officer was conducting private investigations in 1888 that contradicted the official narrative, what else was recorded privately, and what has been lost? There are other fragments. A diary kept by a Whitechapel resident named Emily Marsh, partially transcribed by a local historian in the 1970s, describes the atmosphere of the neighborhood in October 1888. She writes, and these are her words, not a reconstruction, that people in the streets were afraid not of a man they had seen, but of a name they had read. The fear, she observed, was coming from the newspapers. Her neighbors knew the letters. They could recite phrases from them. She notes that several women refused to leave their homes after dark, not because of anything they had witnessed, but because of what they had been told to imagine. The letters had done something the murders alone had not. They had given the terror a voice, and that voice had been distributed by a wire service and printed in mass circulation newspapers to an audience of millions. A retired police constable named Robert Spicer claimed, in an interview given to a journalist in the 1930s, that he had personally detained a suspect in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, a man he believed to be responsible for the murders, and that his superiors had ordered the man released without formal questioning. Spicer's account was never officially verified. It was largely ignored, but it persisted in the marginal literature of the case, surfacing again and again in the footnotes of researchers who could neither confirm nor dismiss it. So let us place these fragments together and sit with what they suggest. A series of murders occurs in one of the most impoverished districts of the world's most powerful city. The murders are investigated but never solved. Then letters arrive at a commercial news agency, not at the police, that give the killer a name and a personality. The police, uncertain of the letters' authenticity, nonetheless publish them. The press amplifies them across an empire. Fear spreads far beyond the neighborhood where the crimes actually occurred. A name is created that will outlast every suspect, every detective, and every journalist connected to the case. Meanwhile, senior officers harbor private doubts. Internal memos disappear. A chief inspector writes a secret letter naming a suspect no one has heard of, and that letter remains hidden for 100 years. Witnesses claim to have been silenced. The one letter most likely to be genuine receives far less attention than the theatrical ones designed for publication. None of this proves a conspiracy. History is full of coincidences, lost documents, and institutional failures that look more sinister in retrospect than they were in reality. It is entirely possible that the letters were genuine, that the police made reasonable decisions under extraordinary pressure, and that the gaps in the record are simply the ordinary decay of time. But consider what the letters achieved. They redirected the investigation. Hundreds of false leads poured in from across the country after publication, and they created a public climate of terror that made rational policing more difficult. They established a mythology that has never been fully examined, and they did all of this while the question of who actually wrote them remains, to this day, officially unanswered. Walk through Whitechapel today, and the streets look nothing like 1888. The tenements are gone. The gaslight is gone. The poverty of that particular era has been replaced by a different city entirely. but the name persists. It is on walking tour signs and pub names and the covers of thousands of books. It is one of the most recognized names in the history of crime. What is interesting is not that the name survived. What is interesting is what survived along with it. Not the victims' names, not the neighborhoods they lived in, not the social conditions that made those streets dangerous long before any murderer arrived. What survived is the name in the letters, the theatrical signature, the invented voice. Somewhere in an archive in London, there are documents about this case that have never been fully released. Yes, Scotland Yard's files on the Ripper murders were, for many decades, subject to restricted access. Some materials remain incomplete. Researchers who have spent careers on the subject will tell you quietly that the record has gaps that do not feel accidental. Perhaps they are accidental. Perhaps they are the simple consequence of 130 years of time, of bureaucratic carelessness, of files misfiled and papers discarded. Or perhaps, in the autumn of 1888, there were people who understood exactly what those letters could do and made very deliberate choices about how to use them. The murders have never been solved. The letters have never been authenticated. The name has never been traced. Maybe there was nothing more to find. Maybe the story is exactly what it appears to be. A series of terrible crimes was an overwhelmed police force and a press that reached for sensation in a moment of public fear. Or maybe the most powerful empire on earth was for a few weeks in autumn, looking in exactly the direction someone wanted it to look, and everything it needed to see was somewhere else entirely.